Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with a treasury of common sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
There's plenty to talk to Leith about this week. G'day, Leith.
G'day, Clinton. How are you?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. Pretty worried when I saw, given I've got a mortgage, probably like most of our listeners, when I saw the CBA a couple of days ago, basically indicated while they're not yet predicting an interest rate increase, they indicated there was a risk. And that followed the comments by Warren Hogan last week after the inflation data was released. And Warren Hogan, who's pretty well respected in the economics prediction game, indicating there could well be 3 interest rate increases this year.
Yeah, mate. Look. All the discussion, and your listeners probably have heard it because it's been, all over the radio waves, all over the TV, etc. Ever since the Australian Bureau of Statistics released that slightly higher than expected inflation numbers last week for the March quarter, basically, a whole bunch of economists have said that either interest rates cuts are going to be delayed. So most were thinking they were going to come later this year. They'll be delayed in next year, or alternatively, there's also a lot of economists now tipping rate hikes. So Warren Hogan was the most prominent. He was tipping 3 more rate hikes this year to 5.1%, which obviously if you're a mortgage holder, especially if you're one living in Sydney with a big mortgage, that's pretty scary stuff. The good news, and it comes from bad news, is that those sort of talks of rate hikes have probably been put on ice because since that commentary came out, we've actually had 2 incredibly weak releases from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which shows that basically the household sector, which makes up more than half of the economy's growth, and it's basically the sector that you and I and everyone else listening here lives in, and that's what we care about, is absolutely toast. So on Tuesday, the Bureau of Statistics released retail sales data for March, which unexpectedly fell by 0.4% in March, and economists were expecting a 0.2% increase. And retail sales, Clinton, were only up 0.8% year on year in nominal terms. Now, the reason, if you listen to that, you think, oh, well, it's still growth, it's 0.8%. You've got to factor in the fact that we've had 2.5% population growth, and we've also had 3.6% inflation over that time. So effectively, retail sales have fallen by 5% in real per capita terms over the year, which is a mammoth fall. And even if you factor in you don't factor in inflation and population growth, it was actually the lowest annual retail sales since 2000 outside the pandemic. So that's nearly the worst result in almost a quarter of a century, the weakest retail sales. And the decline in retail sales was driven mostly by discretionary goods. So the ABS calls them durable retail goods. So that's basically things like electronics and household furniture and that sort of stuff, things that aren't perishable and they're not services. And those actually collapsed by 1.6% over the month sales, and they were down 0.4% year on year, despite the fact we've had that 2.5% population growth and nearly 4% inflation. So the retail sales are absolutely terrible. They're way worse than economists were predicting. And what it basically means is that households are doing it incredibly tough, and they're cutting back, and the consumer spending in the economy is a lot weaker than what the RBA probably expected and what economists expected. And household consumption drives about 60% of the nation's economic growth, and it is the driver of the economy. And if that's weak, it means that the economy is weakening quicker than it thought. And then on Wednesday, the Bureau of Statistics also released cost of living indices for the March quarter. And what that showed, and this kind of explains why the retail sales are so bad, is that for employee households, that's most households across the economy have someone in there that works, so employees, they suffered a massive 6.5% increase in their cost of living in the year to March. So that's 6.5% versus inflation of 3.5% and wage growth of about 4%. So basically, if you're an employee household, which is the majority of us, you're going backwards at a fair rate of knots. And the reason for that, the reason why it was so bad was obviously because this rising cost of living generally, so things like energy prices, insurance, etc. But the bigger factors are obviously the huge rise in mortgage payments and rents. And this rising cost of living, these rise in mortgage repayments and rents, as well as we've had a massive rise in our income tax bills because of bracket creep, has meant that Australian household disposable income suffered the world's biggest decline last year. So per capita household disposable income in real terms, once you adjust for inflation, fell by 6% in Australia last year, whereas it was positive in most other countries. And the reason for that is threefold. It's because we've got mostly variable rate mortgages in Australia, which means that all the Reserve Bank's interest rate hikes have been passed on to us very quickly, whereas overseas most people are on fixed rate mortgages, which means they haven't been hit as hard. We've also had the world's largest rise in personal income taxes in the world because our income tax scales aren't indexed to inflation. And basically, as we've had this inflation, our income tax bills have gone up. At the same time, we had the expiry of this lower middle income tax offset, which basically gave about $1,500 to people who are on lower middle incomes. That expired, so households copped that. And this is just another collapse in, obviously, household income, along with the collapse in retail sales, basically tells you that the Reserve Bank of Australia is going to be really highly reluctant to lift interest rates further because consumer spending is so weak.
Yeah.
And it's the main driver of the economy. And I think all these interest rate hawks who've come out in the last week who've tipped, rate rises have basically been shot down by this data.
Well, that might be good if you've got a mortgage. But overall, for the economy, the fact that we're in that position is not a great thing. I did know with the CBA note that was released, so before that data was publicly released, and they did note that one of the reasons they felt an interest rate increase would be a prospect was because of the high migration.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, absolutely. And I personally know the person who wrote that report, Gareth Aird. He's an excellent economist, and he did a fantastic report on it. I will say, though, that note that came out literally an hour before the retail sales data came out, and then obviously predated the cost of living index. So, but despite that, so basically CBA were tipping that the first rate cut would come in September. Now they're saying it's probably going to be November, but there are obviously upside risks because of the higher than expected inflation. And what the CBA basically said is what I've been saying for weeks on end, is that the federal government's high immigration policy, record immigration is actually driving a lot of Australia's inflation. And, the classic area where you see it is housing, right? So housing comprises nearly a quarter of the CPI basket. So it accounts for nearly a quarter of the CPI inflation basket. And this huge immigration is obviously pumping up things like rents because we've got more people coming in who need to rent accommodation and there's not enough accommodation for them. So we're seeing rental growth go through the roof. It's also putting upward pressure on the purchasing cost of housing because we've got limited housing supply, limited materials, and you're just adding demand to the fire. So effectively, the federal government, by running such a high immigration policy into a supply-constrained economy, is putting upward pressure on inflation, which means the Reserve Bank has, will keep interest rates higher for longer, even if they don't increase them any further. And it means also that if you're a mortgage holder, you're obviously going to be hurting from that. And if you're a renter, you're going to be hurting from that because the high immigration is pushing up your rents. And there's pretty much only one segment of the population at the moment who's almost insulated from this, and that's your retirees who own their homes outright, who don't rent and don't have a mortgage. They're doing quite well, but the rest of us, if you're a renter or you're a mortgage holder, you're getting absolutely hammered, and it's not a great position.
You're not wrong. The New South Wales government has been campaigning for reform of GST distribution. Because they believe the New South Wales, under the latest deal, is being ripped off to the tune of billions of dollars, so more than $10 billion over the next 5 years. Now, the suggestion from New South Wales is that basically states that are doing okay, like New South Wales, are bailing out Victoria. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, absolutely it is. 100% accurate. So, and this is coming from Victorians. So anyone who's listening, I'm actually speaking to Clinton from Melbourne, so I'm a Victorian. But, I can see that the situation is highly unjust. So Victoria has just been awarded through their incompetence $3.8 billion of additional GST revenue. New South Wales has just been stripped of $200 million, roughly, $188 million. And that, to me, makes no sense, given the fact that New South Wales is receiving the most amount of net overseas migrants. Victoria is very close, but New South Wales is receiving the most net overseas migrants. So obviously New South Wales needs to provide services, housing, all infrastructure, all those sorts of things to the massive increase in its population that's coming from net overseas migration. And yet, for some reason, New South Wales is having GST allocation stripped, and Victoria is receiving $3.8 billion. Now, the Victorian government is in deep financial strain. And it's mostly because of incompetence. So there's a rating agency called S&P Global. It's a leading ratings agency. And they've tipped that Victoria's debt is going to rise to about $250 billion by 2027. That's up from about $55 billion in 2019. So they're racking up debt massively. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. They've got a whole bunch of massive infrastructure projects that are experiencing just gigantic cost blowouts. They obviously were in lockdown for longer than anyone else during the pandemic. I'd argue a lot of that was incompetence. Victoria's public sector has grown by 59% in the last 15 years, which is, way ahead of its population growth of 29%. So it's got a huge bloat in the public sector. And its wages bill in the public sector has gone up 152% in the last 15 years, which is just absolutely absurd. It's way more than any other state. And because of that, its economy is basically, in the toilet. Its budget is in the toilet. It's just cancelled the Commonwealth Games and lost $600 million doing that, which they should never have done in the first place, let's face it. And so effectively Victoria is getting bailed out because of incompetence, because it's, drowning in debt. And other states around the country, especially New South Wales, is being required to bail Victoria out, and it's just not fair. And there's actually a former federal Treasury official called Stephen Anthony who's warned that the federal government may be required to bail out Victoria even further. So not just through GST, they might actually have to bail them out with just direct fiscal transfers.
Do Victorians themselves realise what's going on?
Mate, I don't know. I live down here, and they have Stockholm syndrome. So for some reason, through Daniel Andrews' whole term, I thought I couldn't stand Daniel Andrews. I thought he was a deplorable leader, a psychopath, incompetent, wasteful, every adjective under the book. But when you live down here, he was so popular, and I don't understand why. We were the most locked down city in the world. Blowouts left, right, and centre, waste, whatever, any adjective you can use, and for some reason, they're always ahead in the polls. And granted, we do have a useless opposition, which is just lightweight, but for some reason, the Victorians just keep voting for the same mob, and we keep getting the same result. And this Treasury official, Stephen Anthony, he was quoted in the AFR saying basically Victoria's on, quote, a suicide mission to record borrowing, just as global interest rates are about to hit 5%. And he said, potholes can't get filled, emergency departments can't afford clean linen, primary schools can't fix heaters. Things are about to get very ugly. And his tip is that the federal government is going to have to bail out Victoria, which just means that every other citizen in Australia is going to be bailing out Victoria because we all obviously pay tax to the federal government. So New South Wales has just been reamed on the GST, and it's going to get hammered again, no doubt, when the federal government has to bail out Victoria, because you lot will be helping to pay for that.
Yeah, unbelievable. Surely when it becomes the Commonwealth intervening, it'll become a national issue, and then there'll be a bit of focus on the incompetence of the government there. The biggest fan of Daniel Andrews, Leith Van Olsen, thanks for your time, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Clinton. Anytime.
Back next week.